Hey friends, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about all of the books that I read in the month of June 2025. I am absolutely flabbergasted that half of the year is gone, to be perfectly honest with you. It has been wild this summer, and I don't know if you guys have this problem, but one of the things I've noticed is I get this idea in my head in the springtime that we're going to get to summer and we're going to have all this lovely time, and it's going to be, oh, my schedule's not that full. And then it just goes crazy, and all of a sudden we're constantly doing things and going places, and it's really wild. And it seems like our schedule just fills up like crazy, which is a huge blessing in a lot of ways, and it's also kind of exhausting. So if you've been following along the last couple of months, you will know that I've been playing a TBR game with a deck of cards that give me kind of prompts for my TBR, and every time I complete a book that follows the prompt on that card, I earn the card. And it's basically turned into a way for me to kind of gamify not just my TBR experience, but also the way that I have been purchasing books. So I will be referencing which cards that I won on any of the books that were part of the TBR game from the beginning of June. First, we got to talk about the book that I did not get to this month. And I know this was one that a lot of people were excited for me to read. I'm so sorry. However, I got to the end of the month and I knew that there was no way that I could comfortably fit this book in with some of the stuff I had coming up in July that I really wanted to read, and I really do not want to rush my experience with this author. And that was Sailing to Sarantium by Guy Gavriel Kay. The other thing that I was hesitant about when it comes to this book is the fact that this is not the book that most people have recommended that I personally start with. That's Lions of Al-Rassan, which is one of my priority reads for this year. And I was feeling a little back and forthsies about whether or not I wanted to start with Sailing to Sarantium, or if I wanted to kind of leave this one to the side and start with Lions of Al-Rassan in a different month. And that, I think it ended up working out the way that I felt most comfortable with. But I do intend to get to Guy Gavriel Kay this year because I know he is a very beloved author. I just didn't quite fit him into the TBR stack this month. Now, unfortunately, because of that, that means for those of you that were watching my TBR game, I drew my Smaug card, which meant that I had to draw and read 2 SFF books. And this was one of the 2 books tied to that card. So unfortunately, I am not going to earn this card for the month of June. So he's going to have to go back in the deck. Now, I did do a full review slash sort of just ramble about my feelings on the next book, which was the first book that I finished in June. So I will link that up here in the cards so you guys can go watch more thorough thoughts on it. But I read officially my first Stephen King novel in June, and I was so pleasantly surprised by this, you guys. I have been very wary of Stephen King as an author just because of a lot of the content that he includes in his books, and I bounced off of The Gunslinger last year at some point. I had reached out to my friend Andrew from Andrew's Wizardly Reads and asked him for a very tailored recommendation of a Stephen King novel that he thought I had the best chance of giving a good rating to and enjoying. And he picked Doomakey for me. And you guys, shout out to Andrew once again, because this was the perfect recommendation for me personally. This is more of a slow burn kind of slice of life, and it really zeroes in on themes of human struggle and loss within a family unit, and expands into something that is very sinister and mysterious and brings that kind of psychological thriller into the world building once we have a concrete relationship and empathy with those characters. And I loved it. I really did. There were a few things in this book that I didn't love, but overall, I found this storytelling to be really well done. I thought the characters were incredibly vibrant and real, and the storyline and the kind of of the larger conflict of this story is so it's magnetizing. It just pulls you in and you can't look away, which is part of the horror of it. But as far as horror goes, for those of you that might be like me and might be a little bit wary of the horror genre in general, I do feel like this is a little bit more light on that, and I would recommend it for somebody as a starting point with Stephen King if you like the type of story that I just talked about, and especially if you're willing to settle in for a slow burn and really get to know these characters and just kind of see where the story takes you. I think this is a fantastic novel, and for me, it was a great representation of, okay, so this is what I can expect from what for me subjectively would be the best of Stephen King's writing. So that was my first 5-star read of June. So starting the month with a 5-star was pretty awesome, I'm not gonna lie. And then I kept going with something a little bit different, but still kind of having that thriller vein. I read The Feeding by Anthony Ryan. This was an advanced review copy that was sent to me by the author very generously in exchange for a review. And I had read Anthony Ryan's fantasy work before, his book Bloodsong, and I'd also read one of his novellas and really enjoyed both, Bloodsong especially. So it was really interesting to see his tone as a writer is still here, even though it's a different genre, which I absolutely love. You can still tell it feels like an Anthony Ryan book, but he goes into a completely different style of world building, and it's obviously not quite as long as his fantasy novels. This is a story that sort of combines what I would consider a little bit of Walking Dead, a little bit of The Maze Runner, and it has a young protagonist. I would say it's loosely YA, if you know what I mean. Like there's definitely, I can see this appealing to a younger audience. However, I also think that there are enough mature themes in it that it would appeal also to adult readers, which is great because that means that it just has a more widespread audience. There were a couple things about it that I didn't absolutely love. There were some pacing things and especially some character motives that felt a little convenient or rushed, which is always something that pulls me away just a little bit from my immersion and investment in the story. But overall, this is a very fast-paced, very gritty feeling story, and if you like the vibes of some of the stories that I mentioned earlier, this would be a fantastic read for you to pick up. Next up, I read True Grit by Charles Portis. This is a book that has been recommended to me by quite a few different people throughout especially the last year. I recently put out my book, Cold Silver for Souls, which was a fantasy Western novel, and quite a few people told me, oh, having read Cold Silver, you need to check out True Grit. So I did. I read True Grit this month, and I did earn my Sindri card from my TBR game, which was to read a book with a weapon in the title or blood on the cover, and as you can see, there is blood on this cover. Maddie Ross is such a fantastic young protagonist, you guys. I think she was probably my favorite part of the novel. She is avenging the death of her father, and she hires a mean and experienced what is he? Not a deputy. U.S. Marshal. There we go. Rooster Cogburn, who is quite the contrast to this fiercely determined young idealist character. And it's such a quintessential adventure story in the Western genre that I can completely understand why this book has had a lot of longevity with readers up to this point since it was published. And it's a very fast read. There's a lot of humor in it that I really appreciated, and without even trying, because Maddie is funny without trying to be funny. Just the way that she looks at life and her kind of practical, pragmatic view of the way things should be had me chuckling quite a bit. There were a couple of bits that made me frustrated and uncomfortable. It wasn't that they were unrealistic necessarily, which is the word that everybody always throws at me when I say that I dislike certain content in books, but there was some rough treatment of Maddie as a character by one of the other characters that was hard for me to read, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the book suffered as a story because of it. It was just subjectively something that bothered me and pulled me out of the immersion a little bit. Yeah, this is a very fun, fast-paced Western adventure with a fantastic young protagonist and a reluctant mentor character, I would say, on the opposite end of that, which is an archetype that I personally love and would often like to see more of in any genre. So yeah, True Grit was the next book that I finished in June. All right, guys, so moving on to this next book. I have mentioned in a couple of videos recently that my grandfather, who is my last remaining grandparent, and he is someone that I have held very, very near and dear to me my entire life, has recently moved into memory care and is struggling with mid-stage Alzheimer's. And that has been a really tough struggle for us as a family, just to see him that way, and to just the transition of everything that we're all kind of walking through together. There's been a lot of processing going on with that. And so this next book, I didn't know what the premise was completely when I picked it up, but it turned out it was one of those things where, you know, when certain books come to you at the exact correct time for you to read them, this was one of those books, and it is going to be a book that I go back to and reread over and over and over again. And I credit it with helping me kind of process through some of that transition this last month, and just kind of giving me a channel outside of my own reality to grieve a little bit. And that was The Housekeeper and the Professor by Yoko Ogawa. This is a Japanese translated short novel, and it is about a young woman who's a housekeeper, and she is hired to clean house for this elderly man whose memory resets every 80 minutes. And you guys, no book this entire year has made me as emotional as this book did. And I know that my circumstance has added to that experience, definitely. I do think that I would have had an emotional experience with this book either way, to be perfectly honest. It is beautifully written. It is so simple and so beautiful and so full of heart. And what I couldn't get out of my head this entire time is the focus on the dignity of life, and how every person, no matter their circumstances or conditions that they might be dealing with, is valuable and is deserving of that dignity, and also deserving of human connection. And it was so beautiful. I would highly recommend this book just for anybody to read. It is very Japanese novel, modern novel style, where you're going to get that simple, straightforward storytelling. And it works so well. This is such a great example of that style that I would highly recommend it if you're looking for a translated novel to try, or something a little bit more literary that gives you a lot to think about and a lot to hold on to in life too. There's a lot to do with the people being good to each other. And I think that's really beautiful. There's the housekeeper in the story has a young boy who is involved eventually within the relationship between the three of them. And it's just so heartwarming and so beautiful and emotional. And I can't say enough good things about it, and I highly recommend this one. And this was my second 5-star read of June. Side note, I also did earn my Ganos Paran character card for this, which was to draw and read a priority read for 2025. The next book that I read was a continuation of my journey through The City Watch by Sir Terry Pratchett. It is one of the series within his larger Discworld. And I love this series. I know you guys are probably tired of hearing me gush about this series this last year, but honestly, you guys, this series has jumped so fast onto my favorite fantasy series of all time list. I love these characters. Nightwatch is book 6 out of 8 in the series, and it had to work a little bit harder in the very beginning to draw my attention and to pull me in, because the story takes place in a different time period for some of the story, and without spoilers, it's some of the elements that I loved in the previous books up to this point in the series were absent, as we were kind of focused in a different direction for most of this story, which I loved. And I think Terry Pratchett does some of his deepest and darkest writing in this book. I've heard it said that it's never like he's talking down to us with his themes. It's always talking like we're having a conversation. We're having a discussion about things, and he's just laying things out on a table for us to look at and think about. And I think that's absolutely true. He has such a brilliant way of combining his character work with the world building and his themes with that kind of British humor that if you've spent any amount of time around British humor and you've loved it, this series is going to be such a fantastic fit for you. But I also think that for people that aren't as familiar with British humor, the humor is still incredibly accessible to anybody. And it's brilliant. It's the type of writing that always makes me just amazed at his talent, and he's taught me so much about writing humor alongside deep themes and how much of a balance that is, and also the fact that he can walk that tightrope without any kind of wobble at all. So, Night Watch, Book 6 in the City Watch. We're getting close to the end, and that's freaking me out just a little bit because I don't want to be done with this series. I love it so much. But yeah, I absolutely loved Night Watch. The ending was so profoundly good. My husband and I were both in tears when we were listening to the audiobook. It was amazing. Highly recommend this series as a great starting point for Discworld. Or if you are already a Discworld fan and you just haven't read the City Watch yet, why not? Moving on to a chonker. We've been doing a read-along in my Discord for the Sun Eater series by Christopher Rocchio, and we read Empire of Silence back in May, and in June we tackled Howling Dark, which is book 2 of the Sun Eater series. First of all, I have to give a huge shout out to my friends in the Discord who we've had some great discussions about this series and the other books that we've buddy read and done read-alongs for. And I always appreciate being able to talk through things as we read and to see other people's perspectives on the book. It's really helpful, especially when you're tackling a longer series like this. So, Howling Dark. I'm still percolating on thoughts for this series and this book specifically overall. I am toying with the idea of doing a dedicated review to really dig into my specific thoughts in depth in a video in the near future. But in kind of a wrap-up overview without spoilers, there is a shift that happens between book 1 and book 2 that makes the first part of Howling Dark incredibly jarring. And sometimes in some books that I've read, that is a little bit jarring at the beginning, but then I quickly find my footing, I get back into the investment with the characters, and I'm, ready to rock and roll. In Howling Dark, I don't feel like after the big transition that happened in the beginning, I don't feel like I found my footing through the entire second book, which was really frustrating. I didn't love this, you guys, and that surprises me more than anybody else watching this right now, because I went into Sun Eater expecting to absolutely fall head over heels in love with it, and I enjoyed book 1 quite a bit in certain aspects. There were some nitpicks that I had with it. There were some kind of writing style things and pacing things that bothered me in book 1. But overall, it set up a really interesting large-scale conflict, and I was excited to continue and see what Rocchio was going to do moving through the series. I really struggled to get through book 2. Really struggled. And a lot of the points that I think I would have enjoyed more and would have captured my interest and attention more as we work through the storyline of book 2 didn't hit me the way that I wanted them to, because I was struggling so much with the writing style and the character work in this book. It is my personal opinion, having read this, that character work is not at the top of the totem pole for this series. And that's really tough for me. As you guys know, I'm a very character-focused reader, and because this is a first-person narrative, Hadrian as a main character, he's a very internalized character, which I do enjoy. I like characters that are reflective, that think, I like being in their head and really getting to know who they are as people. Hadrian is really pushing me to my limit with that, because it felt like we spent so much time locked in Hadrian's head thinking about the same things over and over and over, that whenever there was a tiny little bit of plot movement or a tiny little bit of character work, it just kind of got swallowed up in the entire like miasma of Hadrian's internal monologue, which got really tiring after a while. So I am planning on continuing the series. I am planning on giving Demon in White, which is book 3, a chance. I am not going to force myself to finish it if I am not enjoying it. We are going to be taking a month off of the read-along just because these are really chunky books, and I just feel like sometimes with read-alongs of big series, taking a month break or a little bit of a break in between books can actually really help as kind of a refresh and reset. And I needed it after this book because I was dragging by the time we got to the end. And while I do feel like there were some really cool world building and concept reveals in this one, it didn't hook me enough to make me ignore the rest of what was going on in the book, because I really, really struggled with this one, you guys, and it surprised me how much I struggled with it. So that is I know a lot of you will probably be not thrilled with that review of Howling Dark overall, but I do intend to dig into my thoughts on that a little bit more, because as you can see, I took a lot of notes while I was reading, and I do have a lot of very specific thoughts about this book and examples of what was tripping me up. So if I do a dedicated review, I will definitely share those with you guys so you know what specifically was making me struggle with Howling Dark. As a side note for that, however, and this is kind of hilarious, but the card that I had drawn for Howling Dark in my TBR game was Darrow, and the effect was to read a book with a hero or heroine on the cover, which could be, translated multiple directions if you've read Howling Dark, but overall it counts, and I did earn the card by finishing the book. My last book in June was Stoner by John Williams. This is a book that I've had on my TBR for quite a long time, ever since I read Augustus by John Williams a couple of years ago, and absolutely loved it. That was historical fiction. It's one of the best historical fiction books I've ever read, despite the fact that the time period that it takes place in isn't one that I typically gravitate towards. Absolutely loved it. Brilliant writing, and I was looking forward to seeing what John Williams would do in a completely different genre. This is like dark academia, melancholy literary fiction. This is not a pick-me-up book, and I didn't go into it thinking that it was going to be. I had heard enough about the story to know that it was going to be potentially a bit depressing. Now, one thing I will say about this is that it is simply an exploration of one man's seemingly very ordinary life, and I think it asks questions like, is a very ordinary life worth living? I didn't come away from this book thinking, oh, this wasn't a life worth living or anything like that. I think for me, it was just horribly sad, because this was for me an example of what happens when somebody just kind of lets life sweep them along in its current, and they don't take hold of much of their own agency in life. And I think that was the saddest part to me, to see the apathy and the lack of communication that happens in this novel, and the lack of standing up firmly for your belief systems. Now, I will say, or even in fairness, like having a strong belief system. Now, I will say, though, there is a moment in this book that I really enjoyed, where it kind of shook up the plot a little bit, because that apathy falls away for a moment, and our main character, William Stoner, does something that I thought was a really interesting examination of his character and where that breaking point is. This was just a really sad book, you guys. I didn't love it. Overall, there were some things about it that just for me subjectively, it's not the type of book that I can see myself going back and digging into again and rereading, and it wasn't a book that I enjoyed per se. I did think that, yet again, John Williams is brilliant at writing characters, and the fact that he can pull off a book like this where he is again, exploring this, what seems like a very ordinary, slow-paced, kind of more thoughtful life with not a lot of, there's not a lot of spectacle here, and that's okay. And I think sometimes we need books like that, because sometimes we can get caught up too much in the spectacle of stories or the reality that we wish we had, or, you know, whatever. But I will commend John Williams heavily in this book for writing a story like this as beautifully as he did, and being able to keep my attention through the entire story. And yeah, so again, this is not a pick-me-up book. And I do not enjoy it as much as I enjoyed Augustus, nor do I think it is as well written as Augustus was. But I'm really glad that I was able to get this off my TBR and onto my has-been-read stack, finally. I felt like a reading fiend this month, you guys. That was a lot of books for me, and I enjoyed almost all of them, and even the ones that I struggled with a little bit more this last month really had me thinking through a lot of things and examining who I am as a reader, and making me think about why I wasn't jiving with the stories or the characters. I do think that this is an important note for all of us readers out there, to be able to critically think about the books that we're reading, because I think that is a skill set that is slipping away to some degree, and that makes me sad. I don't think we have to intellectualize everything, but I do think that as a critical thinking skill, being able to articulate what we like and dislike about books and how we feel about the themes and characters being presented in it is really useful, and it's a really powerful life skill in general. So that's my tiny little TED Talk for the end of this video. But I hope you guys are having a fantastic week so far. I hope whatever you're reading, that you are having a 5-star read, that you're finding new favorites, and thank you for coming along on my reading journey. And let me know down in the comments below what you read in the month of June. Did you find any new favorites? Did you try anything that made you think? Let me know. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video.